reliability update.
Very good, Director Williams. That would be me again. So, in a continuation of themes that we just saw in the draft proposal for SD9 revisions, integrated system planning, we're going to continue our discussion around reliability. And as many of you recall, the district focused on some specific needs for the system in 2019 as it relates to power with purpose. And those needs originated from some aging generation that we have on the system, growing and dynamic communities here in eastern Nebraska. And we set those capital expansion, new infrastructure efforts in motion back in 2019. The beautiful thing about the Power with Purpose effort that Dan will talk about here momentarily is that it was a premier optimization of affordable, reliable, and environmentally sensitive. We checked all the boxes with Power with Purpose. And I think that was one of the things that really made it such a convicting solution for us to continue marching towards Powering the Future 2050. It's important to say at this point that there's no change to that. The direction that we're marching down, we feel is the best way to get to where we're going in 2050, to serve a dynamic load, to make sure the community can count on reliable power here in eastern Nebraska. And so today, we're going to have Dan Lenahan, our Director of Planning and Strategy for our transmission and distribution system, give us an update on the reliability of the system. Dan has over 20 years of T&D planning experience, and Dan's hand has been on the plow, to use an agriculture analogy, for a long time. And Dan knows our system very well. And Dan's been collaborating with Colton Kennedy and many other people in the organization to make sure that we continue to monitor the changes on the system to ensure they happen at the right time and at the right pace. And so Dan's going to talk about some of the changes that we've seen along the Missouri River Corridor. He's going to talk about some national and local challenges that we've seen when it comes to interconnecting new generation onto the bulk electric system. And he's going to also talk about what those challenges mean for us, specifically in 2024 and beyond. So in 2019, we were really focused on the 2022 system, 2023 system, and Dan's going to talk about that. Now that we're in 2022, we're focused on the 2024 system, and is it going to look the way we want it to look? And Dan's going to give us a great bit of detail on that. So before we start the discussion, I'd just like to pause for a few comments if they exist, and if they don't, Dan, you can take it away after 5 or 10 seconds.
All right, I think I paused long enough. So quick audio check. I'm assuming you can hear me by those grins. So excellent. Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Brad. So again, I'm Dan Lenahan, Director of System Planning here at OPPD, and I'll be doing the bulk of the presenting today on this Power with Purpose reliability update topic. And I think Brad already pretty sufficiently went through kind of the outline or the agenda that we're going to talk about today. So if you want to go ahead and move to the next slide, I'll start getting into the background for Power with Purpose. So I want to start off with a little bit of background on Power with Purpose, since it's been almost 3 years since the Power with Purpose recommendation came before the board. I extracted some materials and graphics from our October 2019 public board meeting presentation on our Power with Purpose recommendation, and hopefully it jogs the memory of some of those board members that were here at that time. And for those that were not here, it should at least help provide a level set. So the Power with Purpose project identified the need for up to 600 megawatts of natural gas generation and 400 to 600 megawatts of utility scale solar generation, balancing affordability, reliability, and environmental sensitivity. And this Power with Purpose project was initiated to facilitate three main things. It allows for the planned retirement and fuel conversion of some of the oldest generators in OPPD's generation fleet, which are located at North Omaha Station. We currently have 5 generating units in operation at North Omaha Station, and all 5 of these units used to primarily operate on coal when they were originally built decades ago. And then a few years ago, we initiated a transition plan to retire and partially convert the station. We converted 3 of those 5 units from coal to natural gas a few years ago, and 2 of those units remained operating on coal as they do today. And the next stages of that plan were to retire the 3 oldest units, which are units 1, 2, and 3, and then refuel the remaining 2 units, which are units 4 and 5, from coal to natural gas. And the Power with Purpose project is a big enabler to fulfilling that North Omaha Station transition plan. In addition to facilitating the planned retirements and refueling at North Omaha Station, Power with Purpose also facilitates very large load growth we have occurring on our system. Now, both of these items are shown in the graphic on the lower right, which was copied from our 2019 Public Board presentation material, where we highlighted our projected load growth, which is indicated by the increasing orange line and arrow on the top of the graph. And the gray shaded area underneath indicates our generation supply, noting a declining trend primarily due to the planned retirements at North Omaha Station. The orange space in between the load growth and on the top and the generation supply and the gray on the bottom shows a gap representing a supply deficiency. And if that gap is left unmitigated, we would not have enough generation capacity or supply to meet our forecasted electric demand. And the Power with Purpose generation project fills that gap. In addition to filling that gap, Power with Purpose also maintains critical and historical system reliability and resiliency levels. So with our growing load and planned generation retirements and refueling plans at North Omaha Station, this creates a scenario where a significant amount of bulk generation changes are set to occur where the coordination of in-service dates for Power with Purpose becomes critical for successful project outcomes and maintaining system reliability and resiliency. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on what I mean by maintaining system reliability and resiliency on the next couple of slides. So if you go to the next slide. Okay, so as part of the original Power with Purpose 2019 Public Board meeting materials, we shared a similar version of this graphic on the right, which referenced the changing generation landscape in and around our system, along with our experiences to some extreme weather events. And we talked about these 2 items are challenging our ability to maintain the reliability and the resiliency of the grid, and how they both need to be accounted for as we plan our system of the future. So the changing generation landscape involves the retirement of traditional generation power supplies, like those of coal and nuclear, and the addition of emerging generation technologies, primarily in the form of variable renewable energy sources. As the generation landscape across the entire country started to change a few years ago, our federal regulator over grid reliability, NERC, or North American Electric Reliability Corporation, issued a notice that the quickly changing generation landscape could pose a significant risk to grid reliability, and that these bulk generation changes need to be more closely evaluated and monitored as the grid characteristics are beginning to fundamentally change. And as the changing generation landscape was occurring across the country, it began to occur locally as well. We noted on the graphic that approximately 1,000 megawatts of large conventional baseload generating stations located in or very close to our service territory along the Missouri River corridor have retired, and an approximate equal amount of wind energy has come online, with most of that energy being located remote from our system, which has fundamentally altered the characteristics of the grid in our subregion. And whenever generation changes like this occur in the bulk electric system, we're required to evaluate grid reliability impacts in accordance with federal regulations as directed by NERC. These studies evaluate those electrical system attributes I bolted in the lower left-hand part of the slide, such as thermal capacity, voltage profile, system stability and frequency response, load ramping and balancing, and resource adequacy. And without going into details on what each of those items are, it's just important to know that keeping those items in check helps ensure we avoid large-scale blackouts on the power grid. So through each of these significant generation changes illustrated on that graphic, our system maintained compliance with the federal grid reliability regulations, but we identified and noticed an impact on our grid reliability and resiliency margins, especially as we experienced extreme weather events like flooding, tornadoes, and polar vortexes back in 2017, 2018, and 2019, which are depicted on the far right-hand side of the slide. And as our system experiences those extreme weather events, it became abundantly clear that simply complying with the federal grid reliability regulations as they were defined back in 2019 was not sufficient in and of itself, and that by maintaining reliability and resiliency margins in our system helped us successfully ride through those previous extreme weather events that we experienced without having to implement controlled or rolling blackouts for our area in order to keep the bulk power grid up and running. And to further illustrate my point on maintaining these reliability and resiliency margins and why they're important, I have a graphic on the next slide, which we can go ahead and transition to. So the graphic on the right, we also showed during the October 2019 public board meeting. And this was used to illustrate the declining grid reliability and resiliency margins corresponding to the generation landscape changes and load growth in that Missouri River corridor area over time. And we stated that left unmitigated, we would breach our threshold that would put our system in an unacceptable state. Therefore, Power with Purpose was put in motion to maintain our reliability and resiliency margins, along with supporting load growth and facilitating the North Omaha Station unit retirements and fuel conversions. So upon approval by the board for Power with Purpose in the fall of 2019, we started on project execution for that project. But shortly thereafter, we began to experience some pretty significant challenges and events, which are being shared by many other electric utilities across our entire industry, which I'm now going to get into and discuss. But I can maybe pause here and see if there's any questions on background before I transition to the industry challenges and events. Okay, not seeing any, we can go ahead and move to the slide. Thank you. Okay, the first industry event and challenge I want to cover is the continued changing generation and load landscape. As I mentioned previously, back in 2019, when we were evaluating Power with Purpose, our federal regulator over grid reliability, NERC, identified that the quickly changing generation landscape, also commonly referred to as the changing resource mix, was becoming a top risk to grid reliability. And it's now 3 years later, and NERC has reaffirmed the changing resource mix as a top risk to grid reliability. And unfortunately, this once emerging risk has now become reality that our industry is dealing with today, as evident by the fact that regional generation capacity markets across the country are tightening, and in some cases going beyond just tightening. In NERC's recent 2022 summer assessment report, so for this summer, it identified certain regions of the country are either at an elevated risk or at high risk for not having enough generation capacity to meet their electric demand. So if you note the graphic in the upper right-hand corner where NERC highlighted those regions, that covers half the country. The orange shaded regions were identified as having elevated risk if certain extreme weather events present themselves, and the red shaded areas were identified as having high risk even under more typical summer-like conditions. So in addition to the NERC assessment, each of these regions completed their own deeper dive, more detailed regional summer assessments, which augment the NERC national assessment. Now, OPPD's region, which is the Southwest Power Pool region, has publicly issued a notice that it projects sufficient regional generation supply for this summer, even under a wide array of impactful scenarios. Conversely, 3 other regions, specifically California, Texas, and a neighboring Midwest regions just to our east, which are circled on the graphic in the lower right-hand side of the slide, all issued public notices of potential rolling blackouts due to possible generation supply deficiencies this summer. And the changing generation landscape coupled with load growth were pointed to as primary factors. So the reason I go over this is to reinforce the fact that our federal grid regulator over grid reliability saw this risk coming years ago and warned the industry about it. We took that warning very seriously and incorporated it into our Power with Purpose generation expansion plans, bringing on a balanced generation mix of modernized natural gas plants and utility scale solar. But unfortunately, this is not where the industry challenges end. So if you want to go to the next slide. So on top of the changing generation and load landscape, there are significant challenges with getting new generation onto the grid. Interconnecting new generation to the grid is a heavily regulated process by the federal government, and those regulations are administered by various regional entities across the country. As part of those regulations, any new generator requesting to interconnect to the grid is required to formally establish its queue position or get its place in line, and then go through an interconnection request evaluation study process to ensure federal grid reliability standards are maintained. And this process actually worked fairly well until relatively recently. So new generator grid interconnection requests have skyrocketed across the entire country the past few years, creating a landscape where each region's interconnection request studies are severely log jammed and backlogged by multiple years, which are quickly becoming a major impediment to adding new generation to the grid in a timely manner. In the graphic in the upper right hand side of the slide, there's a map of the US showing each region's backlog generation interconnection requests. And in total, over 1,000 gigawatts of new generation interconnection requests have been submitted to regional grid authorities all over the country that are waiting to be evaluated. For reference, that's a massive amount of new generation requests that would more than double the nameplate capacity of the entire existing generation fleet in the United States. And the transmission grid that has been built out over the years was not built to support anything of the likes of what we're seeing here. And these regulated grid reliability impact studies that the regions,
then just for reference for those for the members of the public who are watching, you know, at 1,000 megawatts, OPPD for our purposes, our peak load is 2,600 megawatts, right? Our generation is about 3,000 megawatts. This is 1,000 megawatts of new generation interconnection that has been requested across the nation. So just to put a little bit of context, what does 1,000 megawatt generation interconnection mean, and how large this is?
Yeah, I guess I might have said it wrong too, but there's 1,000 gigawatts. So
Gigawatts. Yes,
orders
you're
of
right.
magnitudes well above our existing fleet of generation. Yeah, we
I'm
have
not helping here with a clarification. So our generation is 3 gigawatts. This is 1,000 gigawatts, just for comparison purposes.
Yes, correct. Thanks, Javier. Yeah, just the order of magnitude and scale of these new interconnection requests is just massive and is fundamentally changing and delaying how these grid interconnection studies are being done. So these grid interconnection studies are complex electrical engineering computer modeling simulations which determine transmission grid expansion requirements for these new generators. And the more requests that are included in these studies, along with the composition of those requests, mostly consisting of emerging renewable energy technologies, makes these grid evaluation studies that much more complex and time consuming. So due to this dynamic, the interconnection request processing durations in each region have almost doubled from what once was 1 to maybe 2 years in duration has now extended to 4+ years across the country. And furthermore, larger transmission grid expansion requirements are being identified in these studies, which also further delays the ability of new generators to come online from when they originally wanted to. So a very, very complex and cumbersome issue and process, a lot of reform debate going on how to deal with this, but this is the current landscape of where this is at across the entire country. So go ahead to the next slide. So a third and final set of industry challenges I wanted to discuss specifically focus on new solar generation. So earlier this year, the federal government opened what's known as an anti-circumvention investigation, where they are investigating if certain entities are circumventing or bypassing regulations or laws around solar panel imports into the US. And this investigation has essentially brought the solar panel supply chain to a pseudo standstill as this investigation continues. There was a recent announcement on executive action from President Biden aimed at providing some near-term relief, but it's too early to tell the impact that that will have. In addition to that, there's been a lot of siting challenges for solar, where zoning jurisdictions are passing moratoriums blocking utility scale solar development, either to discourage solar development altogether or to temporarily pause solar development so that new solar regulations can be developed, as utility scale solar technology is new to many zoning jurisdictions. And we've ran into both situations locally. So as a result of these two solar challenges I just mentioned, and the other industry challenges I mentioned on the changing generation landscape impacts on grid reliability, and those backlogs and delays in the federally regulated grid interconnection study process, there's numerous examples of electric utilities across the country deferring generation retirement and generation expansion plans. And I've listed some headlines for just a few of those examples, which I just wanted to read real quick. So the first is Evergy, which is the largest electric utility in Kansas, scales back plans to add solar power by 2024. Will keep Lawrence plant partially open. So the largest electric utility in Kansas has significant utility scale solar expansion plans, along with plans to retire older coal plant facilities in the Lawrence, Kansas area. But due to grid interconnection study backlog challenges and delays for many of the newly proposed solar generation projects, this utility had to put those plans on hold and delay retiring their conventional power plant until these grid interconnection backlog issues could get resolved. In another example, NiSource, which is an electric utility in Indiana, cites the Commerce Department solar investigation and plans to delay coal plant retirements. So in this instance, the electric utility in Indiana had plans to retire older coal plants and add new utility scale solar generation. But the federal government's investigation, anti-circumvention investigation, created massive uncertainty in solar panel supply chains. And it's causing the utility to defer both its generation retirement and generation expansion plans by a couple of years. And then finally, just yet another example, PNM, or Public Service Company of New Mexico, seeks to extend life of coal plant for summer demand. Just yet another example of an electric utility, this one in the state of New Mexico, that had plans to retire older coal plants, add new utility scale solar, and is having to delay its coal plant retirements to maintain grid reliability while they continue to battle those same industry challenges of bringing on new utility scale solar generation. So again, these are just a handful of examples of electric utilities altering their generation retirement and expansion plans due to all these recent industry challenges and events. And there's many more examples like this across the country. So how does this all relate to our Power with Purpose project? Well, unfortunately, our Power with Purpose project is not immune to these industry challenges and events, and we're dealing with these as well. So if we transition to the next slide, I can get into those specifics. So similar to other electric utilities, OPPD has plans to retire, refuel, and expand our generation portfolio. Specifically, as a reminder, we had longstanding plans to retire our older North Omaha Station units 1, 2, and 3, and to convert and refuel the remaining 2 units at North Omaha Station, units 4 and 5, from coal to natural gas. And all of these changes were set to occur by the end of 2023 in accordance with previous board resolutions. And those previous board resolutions were made about 6 to 8 years ago. And at that time, the industry landscape was very different than it is now. For example, 6 to 8 years ago, we had very little load growth, and now we have surging load growth. Also back then, there was an abundance of generation supply in our region and most other regions of the country. And as I mentioned earlier, numerous regions are now warning of potential generation supply deficiencies this summer, and that rolling blackouts might be needed because of it. The generation resource mix back then had a limited amount of renewables on the system, and operating experience with that changing resource mix was very limited. Where now a lot more renewables have come onto the system, we've gained more operating experience with that and a more and better understanding of the changing resource mix impacts on grid reliability. And finally, at that time, there was a lot of environmental regulatory changes that were being proposed and debated, and those regulations evolved a lot from their inception to where they ended up in the final rules. So fast forwarding to 2019, as our industry landscape was changing, we made our Power with Purpose generation expansion recommendation plan that was targeted for commercial operation largely by the fall of 2023, which would have been prior to the North Omaha Station retirements and conversions. And then fast forwarding to now, our industry continues to change. We're running into those same industry events and challenges I just discussed in the past few slides. So supply chain, other project execution issues are challenging construction of Power with Purpose gas assets by the end of 2023. Even though we just had a presentation where we're making progress, there are some challenges that are stressing that. Zoning regulations and the federal focus on solar panel imports are challenging progress on the Power with Purpose solar assets. But the most impactful challenge we are dealing with on the entire Power with Purpose generation expansion project is the multi-year study backlog in the regulated generation interconnection request evaluation process for new grid interconnections. So OPPD is part of the Southwest Power Pool, or SPP region, who's responsible for overseeing the regulated grid interconnection process in this region. And that SPP region is highlighted in red on the map shown to the right there. Similar to every region across the country, SPP's generation interconnection process is significantly backlogged and delayed, which is impacting our power with purpose generation and service dates. And due to the magnitude that this impact is having, I just wanted to unpack that in a little more detail on the next slide.
Hey,
So,
Dan, and while we
yep.
transition to the next slide, let me just make a comment about the Southwest Power Pool. In this case, I see it. It's a good analogy to think about them as the air traffic controller. They are helping all of us, all of us utilities that are transforming and putting new generation interconnection requests for all types of assets generation, a lot of renewables. They are helping us do this in a way that is coordinated, so that we don't inadvertently inject more power into a transmission system that is not ready to accept all of that power. So I remain incredibly grateful to the work that the folks at SPP continue to do for us, because they're allowing us to plan ahead and to do this in a responsible and careful manner. So I just want to mention that note of support, and how grateful I am that here in the United States we have this construct of regional transmission organizations that help us coordinate all of this work.
Thanks, Javier, for that ad. And it's probably worth just reminding, I think the board knows, but just in general, the public, that the transmission grid is what connects cities to cities and states to states together. That's why it's so heavily federally regulated, and that there's regions that administer and overlook these processes as well. So that was a good ad. Thank you for doing that. So if we transition to the next slide, I'll unpack a little bit more about the backlogged interconnection process. So the graphic on the right here shows a timeline of how our power with purpose generation interconnection requests are progressing through the federally regulated SPP administered generation interconnection study process, illustrating how that process has evolved and been more delayed over time. So at a high level, wherever you see a gray colored bar in that timeline graphic, that indicates the original estimated duration for our power with purpose gas generation interconnection requests to work their way through the regulated grid interconnection study process, noting that the original timeline would have had us completing the SPP interconnection study process by the end of 2023, which would have been before the North Omaha station generation retirements and fuel conversions. And wherever you see a colored bar that's orange, green, or red, that's the updated portion of how the SPP interconnection process has evolved and been significantly delayed due to all the dynamics I just mentioned on the previous slides. So we implemented numerous mitigation plans in an attempt to minimize the impact of this generation interconnection study backlog, which I just want to briefly discuss. So our power with purpose generation site selection criteria included optimizing existing transmission grid capacity to help minimize potential large transmission build-out requirements that may come out of these studies. Also, we submitted our power with purpose generation interconnection request to SPP in early 2020. So that was as soon as our site selection options were narrowed, in order to establish our queue position to get our place in line for these request evaluation studies. And at that time, the SPP interconnection study process duration was estimated at approximately 2.5 years, which again would have been done before the North Omaha station conversions and retirements were set to occur. And also at that time, of note, there were relatively minimal amounts of transmission network upgrade requirements being identified, especially for requests in our or near our subregion. However, the SPP interconnection study backlog landscape drastically changed since we entered their queue in 2020. Unfortunately, request processing times doubled from what was once 2.5 years to now 4, almost 5 years, pushing our interconnection requests out to the late 2024 or 2025 timeframe before we could anticipate receiving final grid interconnection system impact study results. In addition, massive regional transmission network upgrade build-out requirements started being identified for requests in all parts of the region, pushing out new generator and service dates even further, as the lead times for large transmission grid build-out is significant. So due to this growing study backlog, SPP developed a new short-term option called interim interconnection service to allow generation projects a potential option to bridge a gap until the final interconnection study would be complete. And we began pursuing that relatively new option. However, that option has multiple risks in that it doesn't guarantee power injection rights, as it can be revoked year over year based on changing system conditions through annual reassessments. And these interim studies are now starting to see the same challenges as the standard backlogged interconnections process, as more generators are evaluating this relatively new interim option. Therefore, this interim service option cannot solely be relied on to mitigate our grid reliability and resiliency concerns. Also, OPPD staff has continued to promote and advocate to SPP and our federal regulator, FERC, or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, what we think are needed changes to reform this generation interconnection request evaluation process due to how much the landscape has changed. And some of our recommended changes have been effectuated, and others, they're still being debated and considered. So despite all these mitigation efforts, the bottom line is that the backlogged generation interconnection process has not been resolved for our power with purpose generation requests, and a new mitigation plan needs to be considered. So there's a lot of information on the grid interconnection backlog that I walked through here. So I may pause and see if there's any questions before I transition to the next slide.
Yeah, Dan, related to the the interconnection process, have there been changes made at SPP based on identifying this extremely lengthy increase in the time to do an analysis for new resources coming online?
Yes, great question. I think every year for the past 3 years, SPP has received a lot of stakeholder feedback on how to make the process more efficient and get through these quicker. And they've initiated changes each and every year, some of which were changes we recommended. Just for example, due to the sheer volume of requests in their backlog queue, a lot of these requests come from developers, which are somewhat speculative on projects that they're pursuing, and their first level of evaluation for a project is to see what these grid interconnection studies reveal. So instead of those projects going through this formal queue process and log jamming up the queue potentially, SPP has invoked higher financial security requirements and more land and site control requirements before you can enter their queue to try and curb those more speculative requests, to try and weed out those from coming through and log jamming up the queue, to have them focus on more firm requests that are more shovel ready and ready to go. That's had some beneficial impact, but it's still working its way through their backlog mitigation process. And so I think time will tell, but it seems to be having some kind of beneficial impact, but we're still working through that. And that's just one example of many that they've tweaked and modified their process.
And Derek,
go ahead, Connor.
Your question prompted me to just another reminder. I think that this is a great conversation. The other reminder is Dan mentioned a few times already the federal legislation, federal regulation around transmission interconnection, and part of it is it's a non-discriminatory process where regional transmission organizations cannot differentiate interconnection applications from load-serving entities, utilities who need the generation, versus other utilities who want to put in generation. They may be speculative. They may want to, at some point, sell that generation to a utility. So the Southwest Power Pool and any other RTO has to be agnostic to who's making those requests. And that's why they can raise the bar, if you will, by doing what Dan just described, making it more expensive, or making, putting more skin in the game for people who want to have an interconnection. But that still leaves the list really, really long with a lot of speculative interconnection generation that may or may not happen. And we are competing against those projects in the same queue where we are a load serving entity and we have the need to serve and put these assets. So I think it's a national conversation. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, is taking these really seriously. They are looking at ways to modify the regulations to unlock the logjam that has been created by all of us requesting these generation interconnections.
I think the conversation's been really well had here around first come, first serve. And I think that's been an important messaging thing for us as far as interconnection requests go. And so we do operate in a first come, first serve in accordance with federal law. And Dan made a great comment around the collaborative nature by which we're engaging SPP on this. SPP understands the severity of the issue. And one of the beautiful pieces of SPP's charter is it's effectively a member organization. So we're able to have these conversations in a collaborative way to try and advance this as efficiently as we can while satisfying the various objectives that have to occur within the process. And so I think that's worth saying. And for a long time, that process worked very well. This federal law has been in place for a number of decades now, and we're just getting to a point now where the volume is really starting to stress the RTO's ability to manage, and that piece is a national issue. So thank you for letting me make those comments. I see Director Moody with his hand up, Dan, so I'll pass over to him.
Thank you. Quick thread on that's federal regulation, which would, to your point, Brad, in order to change that, is that an administrative? Is that congressional action? Do we know? Just quickly, I'm curious about where that burden lies.
Yeah, it's really a FERC matter, the Federal Energy Regulatory Corporation, and so just as recently as June, FERC released their proposed docket to continue the discussion on the generator interconnection. And so we see FERC acting on this. We try and work with SPP to interface with FERC around what we're experiencing and ways to improve the process. And we're all watching that very, very closely and participating whenever possible to see those discussions advance.
Yeah, so the commission votes. It's a commission who determines this. Of course, the commissioners are nominated by the president. They're confirmed by the Senate. There's a process, but it doesn't go to the Senate or the House. It's at the FERC level.
Yep. Okay, that's all. I was just trying to understand who had agency. Okay, I've got a handful of questions. So colleagues, if you want to thread on anything, by all means, please just hop in. I won't be offended. Dan, as I was reviewing this, one of the things that I didn't previously, when we had earlier conversations, connect the dots between a study, the results of that study, any actions that were required of that study, and then an agreement. Could you help me understand how those things are threaded together, and when, you've talked already about kind of the delays in the study length, but what happens then once the study is complete? Do we anticipate, and maybe this is the red bar here, a year or two of network upgrades, and then the agreement comes thereafter? Help me kind of put all of those dots together, if you would.
Yeah. I mean, I think you got it. And the red bar is the probably biggest concern, is maybe stepping through the process. Is first you submit a request to connect your generator to the grid. Next, the regional entity does an impact study to see what the reliability impacts are for interconnecting that generator to the grid. And in that study, when it's done, they will identify, hey, here's the transmission build out requirements to reliably integrate your generator into the grid. Those get codified in a service agreement saying your generator can't operate until these facilities are built. And so you can get an executed service agreement, but then it's basically your operation of your unit is contingent upon the fulfillment of the service agreement requirements to build new transmission that was identified in the study. And to your point, is on this graphic, that's the red bar. That's the longest lead potential concern for this.
Okay. That's helpful to understand how those all fit together. I want to talk about the interim GIA just for a second. You described that as revocable. Help me understand. So this is a new tool that they're using. If I remember correctly, they're not common, or we don't have a lot of history. So help me understand on what grounds they might revoke an interim GIA.
Yeah, so this is a little bit more complicated, but I think going back to the principle, either Brad or Javier said it, that it's current policy, federal policy is first come, first serve. And first come, first serve means you have, whenever you establish your queue position through your request, you have first rights on an open access transmission system to the transmission system capacity. So depending on where your spot in line is, if there's generators that have their spot in line ahead of you and they decide to pursue this interim study process, they effectively have first dibs at available transmission capacity compared to your project. And conversely, our project, depending on where our spot in line, has dibs on transmission capacity ahead of where projects are after us in line. And so that's that constant jockeying of who's in line to get capacity, available capacity on the grid. And so the issue you're dealing with is that higher queued or hot generators with their places in the line that are higher than ours can come on the grid potentially later after ours come on the grid and say, well, we want interim service as well. There has to be a reevaluation study based on those prioritized spots in line, and that could impact what was once maybe granted as available capacity could get reassessed the next year and get taken away. So it's a complex, convoluted process, but it's basically based on first come, first serve principles and where your spot in line is and what other generators ahead of you are doing with their projects.
Okay.
And let me interject here really quick, and I think this is important. An important point of to note is the care that took place by the OPPD team many years ago in selecting the sites for both Turtle Creek Station and Standing Bear Lake Station. So these sites were carefully selected for a number of reasons. One, of course, you need to have availability of fuel and natural gas pipelines, etc. But the other very important piece that was thoroughly debated and considered here with the team was proximity to load. And so the closer we are, the closer the generation is to load, the lower the probability of additional transmission infrastructure needs. This doesn't mean that risk is completely mitigated, but I do want to call out that a lot of care was put in place to select the sites that we currently have on those two stations to lower that probability. From Dan's perspective, he's absolutely right. You know, the interim generation interconnection agreement can be taken away because of what he just described, but I do want to let the public know that this is we selected sites that had the closest proximity to the load precisely to lower this probability.
Okay, that's good. Thank you for responding to that. Last question on this slide specifically. This is all gas assets. Power of Purpose is bigger, and we've got the 400 to 600 megawatt goal for solar. Help us understand how solar fits into the color scheme that we've got here. What just could you kind of help me put that puzzle together just a little bit to understand?
Yeah, I think maybe the way I'd answer that is for the gas assets, OPPD is the owner and the submitter of those generation interconnection requests. Whereas for the solar assets, we issued an RFP to evaluate responders to respond to that. They're responsible for going through this interconnection process. And so we don't have control over that. So we just put in here the assets we have more direct control over, if that helps.
Yeah, yep, that does. I was just wanting to make sure I understood kind of the whole landscape of it. And
I guess just to add on to that is the solar projects, whether we submit them or a developer submits them, they're still going through this same process, and same issues are arising there as well.
Right. They're in the same queue, yeah. And because it's agnostic, doesn't matter if it's OPPD is a publicly owned utility or a privately held development company. Same queue, same treatment, right?
Yep, correct.
And last question, and then I'll yield the floor. We don't need to go back slides, but while we're talking about solar, you've talked about siting issues a little bit. And can you remind me, 1 megawatt of a utility scale solar requires how much land? Roughly?
I'm going to jump in there, Dan.
I was about to say I could phone a friend to help answer that question. I want to say I thought it was 5 to 6 acres per megawatt, but Courtney, please fill that in.
Yep, it's about 5 to 7 acres per megawatt, depending on topography and some other things.
Okay. Which when you start to multiply that times 400 to 600 megawatts starts to help us understand the nature of the siting issues that we're running into. Okay, I'll yield. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions on the generation interconnection backlog issue here before I move? I think I saw other hands raised, but
I've got one. Thanks, Dan. And it seems like haven't been paying attention when I ask my question here, but I'm a little confused on the navigation. At the bottom paragraph here, despite these mitigation efforts, blah, 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 a new mitigation plan needs to be considered. So needs to be developed or needs to be considered by the board or by, I'm just, who's doing the considering here and when is it put forward, the new mitigation plan?
I think one thing we tried to do is give people a good understanding on this slide, Director Yoder, around how we were intending this to go based on the information that we knew in 2019, how it's progressed over the last few years, and then the various things we did to try and mitigate these potential challenges that are surfacing for us. And so at the end of the content today, we have some recommendations we'd like the board to consider to mitigate some of this dynamic.
So we have already developed a new mitigation plan. That's what we're presenting today, and it will need to be considered by the board at a future board meeting for vote.
I think that's helpful. Thank you.
yeah, if that was the last question, it's actually a great segue into the next
sorry.
slide, but I don't think it is. So I think I saw another hand.
Yep, thanks, Dan. We talked earlier, and in our SD9 integrated system planning discussion, we talked about how other resources that are difficult to quantify influence our system, and distributed generation on homes and businesses does not require interconnection. I realize it does not address the same problem, but the specific reason that I asked earlier about how we identify a priority on bringing other types of resources online is because while distributed generation and customer-owned distributed energy resources and customer-owned generation doesn't address the capacity problem that we're trying to solve here for reliability, it does have benefits that are difficult to quantify and that are being more comprehensively studied by things like the Vibrant Clean Energy Study that was released a few months ago. And so in the SD9 discussion earlier, I was essentially leading into some discussion about recognizing that distributed resources do not solve this problem, but we cannot say that they do not contribute benefit to the utility and to our customer owners directly. And that's not a specific question, but I do just want to highlight that this is specifically why I asked that question during the integrated system planning policy update discussion earlier. This problem is having comprehensive difficulties for us and other projects and other utilities. And there are other things we can do. And I hope in the proposed mitigation plan that we are looking to other things that can provide benefits to the utility and to our customer owners in the intervening time while we consider what we do for the long-term, more substantial capacity and reliability needs. In the interim, what can we do to continue moving things forward? So I look forward to that part of the discussion here in a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, Director Williams, I think one of your colleagues has mentioned to me that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the next best time is today. And I think to your point, there is certainly a focus on distributed energy resources, demand side management that needs to happen soon. And also with the acknowledgement that the magnitude and the speed at which we need to solve this problem is one that cannot necessarily be solved by distributed energy resources or demand side management, but it has to be part of the solution for a number of reasons. So I wholeheartedly agree with you, and also looking at this new mitigation plan that we're presenting to the board as combined strategies that we need to move forward with. Thank you for that.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that comment, Director Williams. I think that was all the hands raised that I see. So I think we can proceed to the next slide unless I missed one or two. All right, not hearing anyone jump in, I'll go ahead and transition here. So this is kind of a transition summary slide of where we're at to this point in the presentation. So as a reminder, Power with Purpose Generation Expansion Plan was originally intended to largely be put in service by the fall of 2023 to facilitate the North Omaha Station unit retirements and conversions, to support OPPD's growing communities, and to maintain grid reliability and resiliency. The same industry events and challenges that are impacting generation retirement and expansion plans for many electric utilities across the country are also impacting OPPD's plans and causing delays with Power with Purpose. In order to ensure OPPD's reliability and resiliency margins are preserved to help prevent large-scale blackouts, a mitigation plan for Power with Purpose generation delays is recommended to be put in place. Based on the magnitude of the generation portfolio changes and the local and national challenges, there's very few options available. But if you go to the next slide, we have a couple that we'd like to present here for consideration. So option 1, retire North Omaha Station Units 1, 2, and 3 and convert the remaining North Omaha Station Units 4 and 5 from coal to natural gas as previously planned by the end of 2023. This has the beneficial environmental impact of reducing emissions from North Omaha Station. However, as mentioned previously in this presentation, the Power with Purpose project was intended to facilitate the North Omaha Station generation retirements and fuel conversion. But with Power with Purpose being delayed due to all the industry challenges and events I just discussed, proceeding with the North Omaha Station unit retirements and fuel conversions, as previously planned, would lead to significant grid reliability and resiliency impacts. Particularly, our voltage stability and import capability, which are both critical electrical properties that need to have margin to help avoid large-scale blackouts, would reduce by approximately 60% of current levels, leaving the OPPD system degraded and in an unacceptable condition. Therefore, we have an option 2, and that is to defer our plans for the North Omaha Station generation retirements and fuel conversions until there is certainty for the Power with Purpose gas generation grid injection and operation. This has the benefit of maintaining grid reliability and resiliency. The district will need to make additional investments to extend operation at North Omaha Station, but those investments are estimated to be offset by the anticipated regional wholesale market revenues. So considering the two options presented here, we recommend option 2 for extending North Omaha Station for an interim period. And on the next slide, I'm going to unpack a lot more details regarding what I mean by that interim period and this recommendation. So I think we want to transition to the next slide. And then after I get through this, I can pause for questions. Because I know there is a lot of information on the slide, but we felt it was necessary to provide as much detail as possible around the conditions for which we would recommend to continue operation of North Omaha Station in its current capability. So I'll simply just begin by reading the specific language for the recommendation. So, to ensure grid reliability and resiliency, extend North Omaha Station in its current capability until all conditions, including but not limited to transmission network upgrade requirements, as set forth in the executed generation interconnection and transmission service agreements for Power with Purpose gas generation, have been satisfied. So I'm going to spend a little time breaking down what I just said in a bit more detail to try and make that clear what that means. So you will notice the words current capability are underlined and bolded in that first bullet point. As a reminder, North Omaha Station's current capability means that units 1, 2, and 3 primarily operate on gas, and units 4 and 5 primarily operate on coal. Also, current capability does not mean we operate the units exactly as we have in the past. Rather, it means that the units need to be capable of operating like they have in the past to preserve grid reliability and resiliency when called upon.
Also, then, I don't know if you're going to mention this later on, but I think it's important context. There is limited availability of natural gas to the North Omaha Station. So today, we have enough natural gas during the summer months to operate units 1, 2, and 3, but not enough to operate 4 and 5. A question may come in at some point, hey, why don't you switch 4 and 5 from coal to gas? The answer is not enough availability of natural gas. So that's part of the current capability, takes into account the limitations we have of natural gas supply into the North Omaha station.
Correct. Thanks, Javier. That's a good contextual item to add there.
And also, you know, when we converted North Omaha State units 1, 2, and 3 from coal to gas back in the 2015, 14, 15 timeframe, again, that was important to know how much gas we had. We're going to talk a little bit about emissions later on. That conversion of those 3 units from coal to natural gas, along with the addition of almost 1,000 megawatts of wind generation through power purchase agreements, have resulted in the North Omaha station CO2 emissions are today about 2 million tons lower than they were back when we had those 3 units on. So we have already achieved significant reductions of CO2 by having those 3 units capable on gas. They don't operate, they rarely run. But when we need them to run is on the most important parts of the year, and we need to have that gas available on those units in good working condition. So just adding a little bit of context there.
Thanks, Javier. So I think where I left off and where Javier added some more great context is on the current capability of the units in the station and what that means. And so what I also want to talk about is additionally the time frame for extending North Omaha Station in its current capability is recommended to be directly correlated to when our power with purpose gas assets complete the federally regulated SPP, regionally administered grid interconnection process. And so we anticipate receiving those Southwest Power Pool service agreements by late 2024 or 2025 timeframe. And upon completion of those service agreements, we will reevaluate the North Omaha Station extension for potential termination at that time, or further extension pending what the final SPP transmission build-out requirements are that are identified in those studies and that are put in those service agreements, and how long those transmission upgrades would take to build. For planning purposes, we recommend to prepare extension of North Omaha Station and its current capability until at least 12/31 of 2026, which would be a 3-year extension from beyond previous plans. So the reason for this time frame is that we need to prepare for that possibility now, as the decision to extend operations at North Omaha Station cannot be made on a month-to-month or even a year-to-year basis, as there's various factors involved with extending the operation of North Omaha Station that require long lead multi-year preparations, which I'll discuss shortly on the next slide. And this preparation for extending 3 years doesn't mean that the plant will exactly extend for that duration, but we have to plan and prepare for that possibility now. So as part of the plan to extend North Omaha Station operations, we would also attempt to balance environmental impacts and reliability needs by exploring possible options to minimize North Omaha Station coal unit emissions if system conditions allow, along with pursuing interim grid interconnection service for power with purpose generation. Even though it's revocable, we would still pursue it in parallel. And we will continue to advocate for energy regulatory policy reform for new grid interconnections regionally and nationally, as we've done in the past. So in addition to extending North Omaha Station, moving to the bullet points on the bottom, we would plan to expand our large customer demand response programs, primarily commercial and industrial customers. And we would continue to pursue those critical power with purpose utility scale solar resources. So now that I've got through all the bullet points on the slide, I know there's a ton of information on here, but like I said, we wanted to clearly communicate the parameters around extending North Omaha Station in an interim state. And again, that interim state duration will be determined by how our power with purpose gas generation assets are able to proceed to the backlogged federally regulated grid interconnection process, which is an important thing to understand. So with that,
let me
I could
chime in
transition
really
to the
quick.
next slide or just pause here. So I'm sensing.
Before we go on to the next slide, because the next slide we're going to talk about why all the things that we're going to need to start working on to make these a reality. Let me reaffirm to the board and to the public our commitment to execute our Power with Purpose strategy is unwavering. We will get these done. We will retire units, North Omaha units 1, 2, and 3. We will convert North Omaha units 4 and 5 from coal to gas, and we will install and have the new generation online to continue to serve our customer owners. The issue we have today is a reflection of something we have discussed in the past. The transition into a cleaner utility framework, it's neither fast nor easy nor without risk. And what we're finding right now is that we have to take a lot of care, make sure that we are moving at a pace where we can always assure that we will have, ensure that we will always have reliability, that we will have a adequate system protection to make sure that we have the power flowing to our customer owners when they need it, and that we are taking the risk mitigation actions that we need to in order to maintain reliability. It is not lost on me or any member of the OPPD team that this delay of the North Omaha conversion will result in also a delay of the CO2 emission reductions that we were planning to achieve in 2024. That is the biggest concern. And I want to make sure that the members of the public and the board know that we are very aware of that. We want to continue to reduce emissions as much as we possibly can, and we also don't want to put the system at risk. So that's the reason for this proposal for the board. I don't want to minimize the aspect of emissions and how important it is, not only CO2, but all greenhouse gas emissions. We are committed to minimizing and eliminating coal operations at North Omaha when we can safely and responsibly do that. And so I want to make sure that I was able to state that and open it up. I see there are a few hands before we move into the next part of the presentation.
Maybe I'm maybe I'm managing questions. Rick, you can go ahead.
Your hand was up before mine.
Great, I'll go ahead. The proposed extension lists anticipation through December of 2026, but based on the process outlined here, we are subject to external forces, and this is not something that we can guarantee today. Is that correct? Yeah, I guess I just wanted to make it clear that there is an anticipation here, but this is a particular item that in the past we have on multiple occasions had board resolutions and votes and authorization for actions by OPPD leading to the eventual retirement at North Omaha that did include timelines, and the proposed or the recommended mitigation plan today does not have certainty of timeline. And I just want to make sure that we're clear that that is what's included in the proposal, that due to external forces which are not directly controlled by OPPD, we cannot provide certainty at this time about the conclusion of the conversion. I understand that we are focused on that, and CEO Fernandez, I appreciate your unwavering commitment, but I do want to make sure that it's clear that there is not a anticipated explicit date for completion of the conversion included in the recommendation now.
That is correct, Director Williams, although that's one of the reasons why you see the December 31 of 2026 date on the screen. We wanted to provide you and your colleagues on the board and members of the public an idea of when we believe that we should be able to deliver the whole conversion. But as you very accurately stated, our plans are dependent on many other utilities, not only in our region, but across different RTOs, as we are all trying to inject new sources of renewable generation. So from an environmental perspective, I am excited because I hear many other utilities trying to move in the same direction as we're trying to move. We're all trying to move in the same time frame with a transmission system that has limitations. right? And that is what's slowing things down. But ultimately, I believe that this is due to the fact that we, the industry, are all trying to move forward with significant amounts of new renewable generation.
And my only other point there for clarification, we did specify that the extension of the operation at North Omaha would impact our ability to reduce carbon emissions. But coal combustion does have other types of emissions, which are also quantified and federally regulated, and those emissions would also continue and extend beyond the originally proposed deadline. And as North Omaha Station is in my district, I am especially sensitive to the impacts that come from the combustion of coal in a particular part of town and the people who live closest to that facility. So we talk about other mechanisms, including the current capability, meaning capable of generating, but the potential for modification of the way in which we operate our coal fleet. We've talked in the past about rather than a self-commit, a market commit. I'm sorry, rather than a self-commit, market commit to the SPP. I look forward to more discussion about what can be done in the interim period while we await the external constraint to complete the conversion. What can be done to mitigate and reduce the emissions of all types as much as possible through the time when we can successfully complete the conversion. And I know that we're not going to address that specifically today, but I want to make sure that we don't overlook and that we do recognize there are additional factors that are that will also be impacted by the recommended change. With that, Rick, I see your hand next. I'll pass it to you.
Director Williams, if I may, just really quick, I appreciate what you just said. I also want to remind the public and remind the board that in addition to the different operating plans that you just mentioned, we will continue to aim and what we have achieved so far in the past few years of having our coal units being categorized as low emitter status. This is a great opportunity to remind the public that we have limits at which our coal units can emit. We have been able to achieve half of those emissions, and if we achieve half of those emissions on a quarterly basis over, I believe it's 3 consecutive years, those units receive a low emitter status. And so I want to remind the public that we have achieved that low emitter status on all of our coal units for many, many years. I believe we may have lost one of those units recently because one quarter we may have been a little bit higher than 50% of the limit, but that's another commitment that we have. It's something that I think needs to be understood and shared that we are trying to do our absolute best to limit those emissions, even beyond what could be allowed by federal law.
Rick, are you ready?
I think so. Well, I appreciate all of the information we've gotten. It's and CEO Fernandez, I do appreciate your doubling down. I'm not sure doubling quite covers it, tripling down on the commitment to the goals that we have, and certainly markets have changed, the context has changed, and we just have to respond to the world as it changes around us. In our presentation of this information, certainly looking at this slide and just at the words on this slide, the 1, 2, 3, 4th sub-bullet under bullet number 1, we talk about balancing environmental impacts and reliability needs. The reliability needs have been well described. So I'm wondering, can we offer more insight into the environmental impacts that our operations have? You don't have to do it right now, but as we move forward with the discussion and as we move forward with the information that goes out to the public, we're certainly spending a great deal of time, resources, and effort and detail on the reliability needs. I'm not sure that the public is as up to speed on all of the environmental impacts that are involved here.
Yeah, thank you, Director Yoder, for that, and we will take that for sure. Really, this is going back to the conversation we had earlier in the meeting. This is really looking at SD7 and SD9 as proposed, and how do we look at those environmental needs and reliability needs? I would say if you're talking about environmental impacts, we haven't talked about reliability impacts, right? What could go wrong if we were not to address these? So I want to make sure that we're really addressing those two at the same time, and very clearly. SD7 is something that we have in mind, and one of the reasons why we know this is an important topic for the board to consider. But at the same time, it's one that helps us ensure that SD4 on reliability and SD9 as proposed on resource adequacy is that we are meeting those requirements.
Sorry, Greg, go ahead.
Thank you. Can we go back a slide, please? And Javier, you hinted at this, but Dan, I'm wondering the voltage stability and import capability. I didn't write down your words, but what does it mean for it to be in an unacceptable condition? What are the practical implications of that for customer owners?
Yeah, appreciate the question. So I think I'd probably just start off by saying there's a real delicate balance to how much information we want to reveal based on all the numerous assessments we've done on this, which have been a lot. We have to be very careful about revealing critical energy infrastructure information publicly to talk about specific vulnerabilities to the bulk power system. But we also need to articulate the gravity of the situation, that if we don't proceed in the manner we're recommending in option 2, that the orders of magnitude of reductions of certain margins on our system will occur. So this was our best compromise on how to articulate this. The bottom line is that 60% reduction on those electrical attributes I'm mentioning are extremely concerning, and that would, in our opinion, leave our system very susceptible to potential rolling blackouts to ride through those type of degraded system conditions. So that's probably about simply stated as I can make it there.
Yeah, and I'm not looking obviously for you to reveal anything that's sensitive. I'm just trying to understand what, again, like what a degraded system results in X, what is X? And I think you hit it in a sufficient way to help me understand that. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? And Dan, this is kind of where I was asking the question about the connection between study and grid enhancements, and then agreements. So help me understand the recommendation until all conditions, including but not limited to transmission network upgrade requirements. So the study would get completed. They would tell us what the needed network upgrade requirements would be, which I read as transmission enhancements. And so am I reading this correctly in that all conditions being met would include those transmission, the full transmission upgrade being complete and online, and we're ready to go? Is that the point at which all conditions are met?
Yeah, I mean, so the language is including but not limited to those transmission network upgrade requirements, but those are by far the longest lead items that come out of these service agreements. So that's the primary long lead item that could impact the duration for the extension, which is why we specifically called that out. But there's other conditions in these service agreements, but you got it.
And so that's what I'm after. So the service conditions are met when the service agreement is in place. It tells us the things that we need to do in order to get online. We would need to fulfill those requirements as articulated in the service agreement, and then we're up and running. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
I think Director Moody, the other piece, I'm sorry to interrupt, sir. The other piece that's important here is it could be, linear line miles of 161 or 345. That could be an outcome. It could be component upgrades to a substation or something that is not as significant as the former. And so I just want to create the uncertainty here, or the visibility around the uncertainty that the outcomes can vary. And until they complete the study, we won't know those. And when we know those, then we'll be more informed to have a discussion on the in-service timeline. And we can discuss that as soon as we get that information. So I just wanted to kind of propose the ulterior outcome there, that it could be shorter.
That's helpful in trying to understand the potential scope and scale. And last question then. I mean, we earlier in our meeting today, we talked about status update on both of these facilities and the transmission planning work that's underway, right? So in other words, we're not just waiting for the study to be complete to tell us how we're going to connect to the transmission system. We're taking immediate action to move some of that stuff forward. What the interconnection study may tell us what else we would need to do beyond what we're already doing today. Yeah.
That's exactly right. The stuff we talked about earlier is, minimally required for local interconnection. It's the larger regional dynamics of what other generators are coming on in Kansas, South Dakota, that impacts kind of the larger, higher voltage network grid.
So your traffic control that we talked about earlier.
You got it. Yep.
Okay, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay.
I don't see additional questions here. I do have one more myself, and again, comment more than question. We've talked about other types of policy updates today, and now that we've had the presentation discussion here, the integrated system planning process that we've identified earlier, I hope will put us in a position to be more proactive at long lead time types of activities that will be necessary, because to date, we are completing more work than we ever have in the past. But I think we are able to anticipate that the pace of additional work will increase into the future. And so I hope that the policies we are working to update with SD9 on the way in which the integrated system planning is handled, with SD7 specifying the desired outcomes along the way toward 2050, and with SD4 about the resilience of the system, I hope that those will help us to provide guidance on as much forward-looking action and planning as necessary, so that we can avoid similar types of situations happening where things outside of our control negatively impact our substantial plans. And if that is not the case, I want to make sure that we take the appropriate amount of time in each of the policy updates that we are implementing, so that as we come to future decision points about becoming the utility of the future that is described in the Power in the Future 2050 vision, and that we've talked about again and again for the last several years, that we have policy that will allow us to achieve that as anticipated. And so I appreciate the focus on multiple parts simultaneously. And if we need to make any changes to other policies in order to be prepared for those future resource planning and integrated system planning decisions, I hope that we can proactively incorporate that into policy now, so that we'll be more prepared the next time we need to make decisions like this. Javier, looks like you have a response there.
Yes, a response that perhaps it's a great segue for the next section. And so you mentioned very clearly, and I wholeheartedly agree with you on the need for us to have those processes in place, the policies for us to really look into the future. And it's to ensure, and this is on me, to ensure that we are growing this organization and that we have the labor, the capital, the infrastructure capability to meet the growing demands of our customer owners. Very clearly, something that we saw during the Pathways to Decarbonization study was all the different electrification scenarios. And it is not out of the question that by 2050, we could have load that is 2.5 times the load that we have today, right? So as we're looking at policies and planning, my duty is to present to the board the needs, the organizational requirements that we're going to have to meet that growing load. And it comes in all flavors: more people, more capital, more tools in order for us to grow with the region. Ideally, you want to grow a little bit before the region's demands grow, not too far into the future, but not too slow. So it's picking the right time. And I think this goes back to your point, Director Williams, of having policies that really allow us to build that margin to continue to grow and meet the growing demands of our district. Think about electrification of the economy, transportation, and heating and heat pumps, and it's getting more complex, and it's growing at a pace that we haven't really seen in the past. So So we have our work is cut out for us in the future, and I really appreciate having this discussion because it really highlights the challenges and the opportunities that we as an industry have going forward. And perhaps this is a good segue into the resources. I talked about resources. I think we're going to talk about more tactically what needs to happen in order for this recommendation to move forward and all the pieces that in this puzzle that need to come together. So Dan, I don't know who's going to take the next part of the presentation.
Yep, no thanks, Javier. That's actually a great segue. So if we can go to the next slide, I think I've got just a handful more slides and then we'll conclude. So as you mentioned, as we prepare for possible 3-year extension for North Omaha Station and its current capability, as the decision, to extend North Omaha Station can't be made on a month-to-month or even a year-to-year basis due to the long lead planning items involved. I just wanted to describe some of those long lead planning items that I talked about. So first of which is staffing. Review of critical staffing requirements to operate the station and its current capabilities currently in progress. And the qualifications and training required to operate the station takes several years to obtain. So a thoughtful and careful approach to maintain adequate staffing levels is required. Also, there's going to be additional maintenance and capital improvement work needed. So using your car as an analogy, just like you need to perform maintenance or replace old equipment on your car for extended operation, so must we do too for a power plant. And planning and coordinating that work during limited planned outage durations requires a lot of long lead time preparations. Also, there's going to be additional fuel acquisition required, along with environmental permitting considerations. And our environmental regulatory affairs and energy production teams will continue the strong partnership with our regulators to ensure sufficient regulatory margin and permit compliance for this recommended change. And finally, there's going to be a significant stakeholder outreach effort involving communication to inform the many stakeholders on this recommendation. And we'll spend a bit more time on that stakeholder outreach plan shortly in the next couple slides here. So if you go to the next slide. Before we just unpack the stakeholder outreach plans, I just wanted to go over a summary of what our next steps are. And first, we're going to initiate plans to prepare for North Omaha Station extension and its current capability, not execute plans or execute the project, but initiate plans to prepare for it because of the long lead items I mentioned. We're going to do that while pursuing options to address environmental impacts and reliability needs. So just as a quick reminder, I think we've talked about this a fair amount today during the committee meeting, but OPPD's board has developed strategic directives or SDs, which guides much of the district's or management's decision making. And there's a select set of those SDs which address environmental impacts and grid reliability. And the board's continually reviewing those SDs, like we talked about earlier, based on emerging trends, events, and challenges that continue to impact our industry. So we just wanted to quickly highlight some of those potential revisions to those relevant SDs as they pertain to the topic today. So the first is SD9, resource planning, and we already talked about this, but the board's evaluating potential revisions to this SD to clarify how grid reliability and resiliency are considered in integrated system planning. Next is SD7, environmental stewardship. The board's evaluating potential revisions to incorporate interim metrics as OPPD pursues our net zero carbon goal by 2050. And finally, there's SD4 reliability, and the board's evaluating potential revisions to that to narrow this to SD's focus more on operational reliability metrics, pending the outcome of revising SD9 to focus more on planning forward for reliability and resiliency. So also, as part of our next steps, OPPD will continue advocacy for energy regulatory policy reform for new grid interconnections at both FERC and SPP. We will continue evaluation of interim interconnection service options for power with purpose generation, along with expansion options for our demand response program. Stakeholder outreach efforts will commence from now until the August board meeting, and we will describe that in a little more detail in the next slide. And then finally, the mitigation plan recommendation to extend North Omaha Station in an interim state is requested to be voted on at the August board meeting. So with that, unless there's any questions on our next steps, I'll turn it over to Lisa Olson to talk more about our stakeholder outreach plans and further details on this timeline.
So a quick question here. You noted early on that one of the market is changing. one of the bottlenecks / barriers, I guess, are the zoning regulations in the nearby counties. And that does seem to be an area where OPPD has some influence as well. Is that something that would weave into this, or is that?
Yes. We have some influence, but as you are well aware, as a member of a local elected body, local control is very important. So I think we have engaged with as many county commissions, planning commissions, trying to share the importance of all of our generation plans, including utility scale solar. We have some ability to influence, but not unilateral. We have to work with county commissions, especially under the purchase power agreement concept, where we have been relying on the tax credits that private developers can achieve, and they have to engage and they have to get approval from county commissions. So I personally, and you know this, Director Yoder, we have been working really hard, working in partnership with our counterparties in the county planning commissions and county commissioners, helping them understand the need. And for us also to listen to their concerns, the concerns about land use and location of potential solar setbacks. We have learned a lot through this interaction, and we're making some progress, sometimes a little slower than we would like to, but we're working very hard trying to get county commissioners comfortable so that when a project comes to their table, they're comfortable approving it. But ultimately, it's up to them. And so we have also discussed internally with my team the potential option of us owning and operating and building solar on our own, something that we haven't necessarily pursued in the past, because we always like to work hand in hand and in good collaboration with our neighbors, with our counties. They are our customer owners, but at the same time, we have a service to deliver. We have timelines. Our load is growing, and we have a need for us to install and connect generation as fast and as safely as we possibly can. So nothing is off the table. We continue to work with counties, and we will keep this body and our stakeholders appraised as we make progress. But thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing, Director Yoder, I just want to make sure you saw is two slides ago. We had a bullet point on the criticality of continuing to pursue the solar, and so there's been a number of counties where you know, the conversation has gone really well, specifically around conditional use permits, and so we're trying to continue to stay connected with some of those counties and leverage what those counties have been able to do, maybe in some other counties that are interested in what this might look like. But I do want to be really clear on Javier's point. When we announced Power with Purpose in 2019, there is no aspect of Power with Purpose that is elective. We need the resources to serve the load. And we're working very diligently with a lot of partners to be able to do that. And so I appreciate being able to make that comment.
Well, if I could thread on that, that's really well said, Brad, that none of it's elective. But for purposes of today and this recommendation, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm really connecting and I'm looking at the specific recommendation is about gas generation. The if is the gas generation, the then is the North Omaha. And even if by chance we see a massive rush on solar because all of the barriers just slipped away magically, it's still about that gas asset, those gas assets, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a great characterization. And this is a point we should be really clear on. The dispatchability of the natural gas assets allows us to continue the desired work at North Omaha Station. Our ability to serve load predictably across the system as a whole requires all of the resources that have been recommended and approved. So thank you very much, Director Yoder. I'm sorry, Director Moody, excuse me.
Nope, that's good. That's what I needed. Thank you.